Hello, my name is Mike Schmidtke, and I'm a fisheries scientist with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. In this presentation, I'll be discussing Amendment 60 to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan, which considers changes to several commercial management measures. Before we get into the amendment itself, I'll go over some housekeeping for the presentation and comment process that will be part of the public hearings. First, I will review the amendment as developed to this point. Next, I'll pause to answer clarifying questions about the amendment. Finally, a council member will chair the comment portion of the meeting, calling on those who attend the hearings and want to provide verbal comments. The South Atlantic Council is one of 8 regional management councils that are responsible for managing fisheries in the U.S. exclusive economic zone, which ranges from 3 to 200 miles offshore. The South Atlantic Council is responsible for EEZ waters off North Carolina through the Florida Keys. Council members include recreational and commercial fisheries stakeholders, state marine agency representatives, and federal agency representatives. The 13 voting members include the marine agency representative from each state, 2 citizen representatives from each state, and the Southeast Regional Administrator of NOAA Fisheries. The Council's role in the management process is to develop management plans for South Atlantic fisheries and recommend regulations to NOAA Fisheries. NOAA Fisheries considers Council recommendations and implements fishery regulations for federal waters. Public hearings are an important step in the Council's amendment development process. These are conducted after the Council has spent some time discussing potential actions to take and developed alternative ways to address each action. The Council has already gathered initial public feedback through scoping and comments received during Council meetings. Now, we are approaching the final stages of the amendment, during which the Council will need to decide their preferred courses of action. Through public hearings, the Council seeks input from stakeholders before they make their final decisions. Here we see the projected timeline for Amendment 60. We are currently in the public hearing step of this process. 3 in-person hearings will be held, as well as 1 online hearing and a final hearing held in conjunction with the Wednesday public comment session for the September 2026 Council meeting. The Council meeting public comment session has both in-person and online accessibility. During the September meeting, the Council will review public comment and approve the actions in Amendment 60, meaning after that point they do not intend to add any more actions to the amendment. By the end of the December 2026 meeting, the Council is scheduled to have selected preferred alternatives for each action in the amendment, and have a final vote to approve the amendment for submission to the Secretary of Commerce for review and implementation. After the Council submits an amendment, the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries, conducts their rulemaking procedures to determine which Council recommended actions will be implemented and establishing implementation procedures as necessary. Timelines for this step can vary depending on the actions being taken, so presented timelines are tentative and subject to change. Ideally, actions from Amendment 60 may be effective by the end of 2027. Amendments include 2 core components that describe the regulatory changes being considered. Actions describe the types of changes being considered. For example, an action may be to revise a commercial trip limit. Alternatives are specific options under each action. For example, maintaining a current trip limit of 100 pounds, increasing to 120 pounds, or decreasing to 80 pounds are all potential alternatives under the example action of revising a trip limit. For all actions, alternative 1 or no action represents maintaining the regulation or policy that is currently in effect. The goal of public hearings is to hear from stakeholders which of the considered alternatives should be preferred for implementation and reasons why the Council should prefer one or a set of alternatives over others. Amendment 60 includes 10 actions, which I will summarize in the following slides. I will highlight a few notes related to the discussions about each action to this point. But for a more comprehensive view of the discussions and analyses of anticipated effects, I encourage you to look at the draft amendment document itself, posted on the Amendment 60 public hearing webpage. Action 1 considers removal of the 2-for-1 requirement for transferring SG1 commercial permits. Currently, to transfer an SG1 permit to anyone other than an immediate family member or family corporation, 2 SG1 permits must be acquired and exchanged for 1 permit under the new owner. The Council has initially selected Alternative 2 as preferred, which would remove the 2-for-1 requirement, allowing transferal of a single permit to a new owner. This action would maintain the limited access nature of the SG1 permit under either alternative, meaning the only way to acquire an SG1 permit would continue to be through the transfer of an existing permit. No additional permits would be created. The Council has stated their intent for this change is to stop the reduction in permits that has occurred under the 2-for-1 requirement and maintain the current number of SG1 permits moving forward. Action 2 considers changes to the species restrictions and establishes stowage requirements for snapper grouper commercial trips with bottom longline gear on board. Under current regulations, a commercial snapper grouper vessel with bottom longline gear on board is restricted to possessing only the following deep water associated snapper grouper species: snowy grouper, yellow edge grouper, misty grouper, golden tilefish, blue line tilefish, and sand tilefish. This means that even if another gear is used as the mode of harvest, if bottom longline gear is on board, no other snapper grouper species is allowed to be possessed. The intent of this action is to allow greater flexibility for fishermen to be able to switch gear within a commercial trip, specifically with respect to bottom longline gear. Alternatives 2 through 4 all deal with harvest and possession of snapper grouper species similarly. Each of these alternatives would remove the species restriction on possession. However, the restriction would remain with respect to harvest using bottom longline gear. So bottom longline gear still may not be used to target or harvest species other than the deep water associated group shown on the slide. However, fishermen would now have the ability to stow their bottom longline gear by removing baits from the hooks or placing the gear below deck, and then use a different gear to harvest the entire management unit of snapper grouper species. This would also include harvest and possession of wreck fish for those who hold quota shares. Logistically, harvest and effort from different gears within a trip should be recorded in commercial logbooks as separate entries. Alternatives 2 through 4 differ in the type of required communication with law enforcement in order to use this flexibility. Alternative 2 would have no additional communication requirement, other than completing the commercial logbook as described previously. Alternative 3 would require vessels that intend to switch to or from bottom longline gear to send a notification prior to each gear change to the National Marine Fisheries Service using an approved method that will be listed on the agency's website. Alternative 4 would require vessels that intend to switch to or from bottom longline gear be equipped with an active and approved vessel monitoring system, or VMS, and that a notification to the National Marine Fisheries Service would be sent via that VMS before each gear change. Any of the notification or equipment requirements from alternatives 3 and 4 would only apply to vessels that intend to switch to or from bottom longline gear within a single trip. They would not be required of vessels that are not making this type of change. Some example situations where the notification or VMS requirement would not apply include vessels that only fish hook and line within a trip, vessels that only fish bottom long line within a trip, or vessels that fish multiple gears not including bottom long line, such as a trip that includes fishing with hook and line as well as spear fishing. These vessels would not be required to submit the gear change notifications or carry a VMS under alternatives 3 and 4. Those requirements would only be for vessels that switch to or from bottom longline gear within a single trip. Actions 3 through 9 consider commercial trip limit increases for several snapper grouper species. Species considered for increases were decided by the Council's Snapper Grouper Commercial Subcommittee, who were looking for those that have species-specific trip limits, so not species that are managed with others as a complex, as well as those species that have not approached their commercial annual catch limits or ACLs in recent years, with an exception made for the hook and line component for golden tilefish, which has had more mixed results than other species. The intent of these actions is to allow additional flexibility for fishermen. The Council recognizes that species-specific trip limits have often not been limiting for those species considered for increases. Other factors like boat capacity, weather, and trip timing play a role. So the expectation is not necessarily that every trip would suddenly limit out at higher levels. The intent here is for when the bite for a particular species is good on a trip, then fishermen can take advantage of that opportunity at a higher level than before. Annual catch limits are still in place for all of these species, and catches are monitored in season to prevent overfishing. Action 3 considers an increased trip limit for greater amberjack. Greater amberjack, like a few other species in Amendment 60, is managed using a split season. This means that part of the ACL is evaluated through the first season of the year, such that if that partial ACL is met, the fishery could close for the remainder of that season. It would then reopen for season 2, which has its own partial ACL for catch during that time of year. This management structure has sometimes led the Council to consider different seasonal trip limits in the past, so alternatives were structured to allow this consideration in Amendment 60. The current trip limit is 1,200 pounds year-round. The Council is considering limits up to 2,000 pounds gutted weight, and their preliminary preferred limit is 1,750 pounds gutted weight year-round. Action 4 considers an increased trip limit for vermilion snapper. This is another species with a split season. The current trip limit is 1,000 pounds gutted weight year-round. The Council is considering limits up to 2,000 pounds gutted weight, and their preliminary preferred limit is 1,500 pounds gutted weight year-round. Action 5 considers an increased trip limit for red porgy. This is another species with a split season. The current trip limit is 15 fish year-round. The Council is considering limits up to 45 fish, and their preliminary preferred alternative is to maintain the current 15 fish limit. The Council has discussed specifically for red porgy their long-time overfished status and how the stock has not rebuilt, despite very low annual catch limits and rebuilding plans for roughly 35 years. The lack of recovery for this stock with such a long time rebuilding, which is also reflected in fishery independent survey numbers remaining at all-time low levels, may indicate some uncertainty in our understanding of long-term sustainable population and harvest levels for red porgy. With that being the case, the Council's initial preferred alternative reflects leaning toward a continued conservative approach for this species. Action 6 considers an increased trip limit for hogfish from Georgia through North Carolina. The current trip limit is 500 pounds whole weight. The Council is considering limits up to 1,000 pounds whole weight. and has not selected a preliminary preferred alternative for this action. Action 7 considers an increase in the trip limit for red grouper. The current trip limit is 200 pounds gutted weight. The Council is considering a higher limit of 300 pounds gutted weight. The Council noted that red grouper is also in a rebuilding plan, so any increase should be modest. However, from fishery independent surveys, red grouper in recent years have shown some stabilization and potential signs of growth as the stock nears its target rebuilding year of 2028. The Council has not selected a preliminary preferred alternative for this action. Action 8 considers an increased trip limit for gray triggerfish. This is another species with a split season, but the Council decided not to consider seasonal trip limits for this species. The current trip limit is 1,000 pounds whole weight. The Council is considering limits up to 1,400 pounds whole weight and has not selected a preliminary preferred alternative for this action. Gray triggerfish are unique among the species included in this amendment because they are the only species being considered for a trip limit change that does not have a stock assessment completed. Assessments have previously been attempted, but none have successfully estimated population size or been recommended as a basis for annual catch levels. Gray triggerfish are monitored through fishery independent surveys, and some concern has been expressed about recent declines in those estimates, along with the lack of a stock assessment. Golden tilefish commercial catch is managed separately by gear, with part of the commercial ACL being designated for longline gear and the other part being designated for hook and line gear. These gears also have different trip limits. Action 9 only considers an increase to the trip limit for the hook and line component. The current trip limit is 500 pounds gutted weight. The Council is considering limits up to 750 pounds gutted weight, and their preliminary preferred limit is 600 pounds gutted weight. Golden tilefish annual catch has typically been closer to its limit than other species considered in this amendment. However, the Council is considering this trip limit increase due to a relatively lower harvest in 2025, a recent stock assessment that indicates the golden tilefish population is healthy, and increased trip costs that particularly affect the golden tilefish fishery, which operates further offshore and in deeper water than other snapper grouper species. Action 10 considers a requirement to sell all snapper grouper harvest from commercial trips. Currently, there is not a requirement to sell commercial harvest, but if harvest is sold, it must be sold to a commercially permitted dealer. The requirement for who to sell to would remain in place under either alternative. Alternative 2 would add a requirement that if snapper grouper are harvested on a commercial trip, they must be sold. A commercial trip would be defined as a trip by a snapper grouper commercially permitted vessel that either harvests any snapper grouper species above the recreational bag limit or sells any amount of snapper grouper that were caught on that trip. Action 10 is intended to ensure that commercial permits are being used to harvest snapper grouper with the intent to sell. The Council has expressed some concern about snapper grouper permits being acquired by fishermen that do not sell their catch, essentially being able to fish recreationally at higher limits. This action would also have the benefit of improving commercial dealer reporting, as fish that are harvested commercially but kept for personal consumption are not accounted for in dealer reports, which are the main data source for in-season catch monitoring. A similar requirement is in place in the Gulf, where fish kept for personal consumption are essentially sold to the dealer and bought back by the fishermen, so they still get included in the dealer reports. Under Alternative 2, sale would only be required for snapper grouper. Sale requirements may exist for other non-snapper grouper species, but these would be defined by other management plans. So fishermen should be aware of the regulations for all species that they are harvesting. For example, if gag grouper and king mackerel were caught on the same trip, Alternative 2 would require that all of the gag harvest must be sold. But any requirements for how to handle the king mackerel would be defined by the Coastal Migratory Pelagics Management Plan. Also under Alternative 2, commercial vessels would still be able to be used as a recreational vessel, as long as they are not conducting a commercial trip, as defined in that alternative. This means that in order to operate as a recreational trip aboard a vessel that has a commercial permit, all harvest of snapper grouper on that trip must be within recreational bag limits, and no snapper grouper from that trip may be sold. The issue of how to address fish that have spoiled or are otherwise rejected by the dealer for sale came up during the June council meeting. This is an outstanding discussion point for this action, and the council will talk more about that issue in their September meeting. The Council is requesting input from you on recommendations and information related to the actions in Amendment 60. First, the Council would like to know whether you support the preliminary preferred alternatives, with reasons of why or why not. Second, are there other alternatives that you think the Council should select as preferred, including those actions for which the Council has not indicated an initial preference? Providing reasoning along with any supported alternatives will help the Council choose between alternatives and develop a record supporting their final decisions. Comments can be provided to the Council using several different methods. The deadline for comments to be included in the summary that will be provided at the September 2026 Council meeting is September 1st, 2026. Comments can be provided after this date, but those would be incorporated into the summary that goes in the draft amendment for the December 2026 Council meeting. 5 public hearings are being held, during which stakeholders can provide verbal comments. Public hearing dates and locations are shown here, with additional information available on the Council's website. Written comments can be submitted online using the Amendment 60 comment form on the Council's website. Written comments can also be submitted via mail or fax using the information shown on the screen. If you have clarifying questions about this process or Council discussions about the commercial snapper grouper fishery thus far, please feel free to contact me, Mike Schmidtke, using the information shown on the bottom left of the screen. This concludes the recorded presentation. Thank you for your time, attention, and interest in South Atlantic Council Fisheries Management.